There's a question that doesn't get asked often enough, and once you notice it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Why do government buildings, courthouses, libraries, and train stations built in the 1800s across completely different countries, on completely different continents, look almost identical? Not similar in the way that trends spread. Not loosely inspired by each other. Structurally, proportionally, and decoratively consistent in ways that go beyond shared taste or fashion. We're talking about buildings in Philadelphia that share nearly the same facade language as buildings in Budapest. Structures in Melbourne that could be swapped with structures in St. Petersburg, and nobody would blink. Train stations in Mumbai that carry the same arched window ratios, the same column placements, the same dome profiles as civic buildings in Washington, D.C. Now the standard explanation for this is well known. The architectural movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, neoclassical, Beaux-Arts, Second Empire, spread across the globe through colonialism, trade, academic exchange, and the ambitions of ruling classes who wanted their cities to look sophisticated. That explanation works to a degree. It accounts for why European architectural styles show up in colonized territories. It accounts for why certain proportions and motifs repeat across Western capitals. But it doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain why so many of these buildings demonstrate a level of masonry and stonework that would be difficult to replicate today even with modern equipment. It doesn't explain why cities that were supposedly frontier towns or recently settled territories already possessed massive, ornate civic buildings within years of their official founding. And it doesn't explain why the construction methods visible in these buildings, particularly the precision of the stonework, the enormous scale of individual blocks, and the uniformity of execution across thousands of miles, seem to exceed what the documented workforce and tools of the period could reasonably have produced. Let's stay with the physical observations for a moment because that's where this gets interesting. Look at the old civic buildings in nearly any major city that was established or expanded during the 1800s. You'll find recurring features that go well beyond stylistic choice. Arched windows grouped in threes. Rusticated stone bases. Columns that follow precise mathematical ratios. Domed rooftops with lantern structures at the apex. Rose windows. Symmetrical facades with central entrances flanked by identical wings. Interior spaces with vaulted ceilings, mosaic floors, and acoustic properties that suggest the builders understood sound propagation at an advanced level. These are not superficial similarities. These are structural and engineering consistencies. Take star forts as another example. These are military fortifications built in a star-shaped footprint, designed so that every wall could be defended from an adjacent wall with overlapping fields of fire. They exist on every inhabited continent. Hundreds of them. The official explanation is that the design originated in Renaissance Italy and spread through European military engineering. That makes sense for Europe and European colonies. It makes less sense when you find star forts in places that had no documented contact with Italian military architects, built with local materials, but following the exact same geometric principles, the same angular measurements, the same proportional relationships between walls and bastions. The consistency is what raises the question. Not any single building, but the pattern. And within that pattern, there's another detail worth noting. Many of these buildings, particularly in North America and Australia, were attributed to architects and builders who, according to the historical record, had limited resources, small teams, and remarkably short construction timelines. City halls that supposedly went up in 2 or 3 years. Courthouses built by towns with populations in the low thousands. Post offices and customs houses with granite facades and hand-carved ornamental details in places that had no nearby quarries and no documented rail connections at the time of construction. When you look at the photographs from the period, you often see something that doesn't match the founding narrative of these cities. The buildings look too established, too weathered, too integrated into the landscape to have been recently built. In some cases, photographs from the 1860s and 1870s show city centers that look like they've been standing for centuries, not decades. This is not proof of anything on its own. Old photographs can be misleading. Weathering rates depend on material and climate. Construction records from the 1800s are often incomplete simply because record-keeping standards were different. But the pattern is consistent enough and widespread enough to be worth looking at carefully. There's also the question of the interiors. Many of these 19th-century civic buildings feature heating systems, ventilation channels, and what appear to be utility conduits built directly into the walls and foundations. These are not later additions. They're part of the original construction. In some cases, the infrastructure embedded in these buildings suggests a level of planning and systems integration that doesn't align with the available technology of the period as we understand it. None of this means the official historical narrative is wrong. It means there are details within that narrative that don't have complete explanations. And when those incomplete explanations appear in building after building, city after city, continent after continent, the responsible thing to do is to look more closely rather than less. So that's where we start. Not with a claim. Not with a conclusion. Just with the observation that the built environment of the 19th century contains patterns that are worth examining on their own terms, without rushing to explain them away or inflate them into something they may not be. And one of the most direct ways to examine those patterns is to look at what the maps of that period actually show. If the buildings raise questions about who built them, the maps of the same period raise questions about who lived where and how the world was organized before the boundaries we know today were drawn. From the 16th century through the late 18th century, European cartographers consistently depicted a vast territory called Tartaria, sometimes labeled Grande Tartarie or Great Tartary. This wasn't a fringe notation on obscure maps. It appeared in the work of the most respected mapmakers of their respective eras. Abraham Ortelius, Guillaume de Lisle, Gerardus Mercator, and dozens of others included Tartaria as a defined region, often occupying the largest single landmass on the map, stretching from the Ural Mountains east through Siberia and into parts of Central Asia, Manchuria, and in some depictions, the western edges of North America. These weren't speculative maps. Many of them included detailed notations about cities, rivers, mountain ranges, and trade routes within Tartaria. Some distinguished between different regions within the territory: Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica included an entry on Tartary describing it as a vast region spanning much of Asia, with its own peoples, customs, and governance structures. This is documented material. It's sitting in libraries and archives. It's not hidden. What is harder to explain is how a territory that large and that consistently documented could essentially vanish from the historical record within a single century. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria had been almost entirely absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty. The name disappeared from maps. The encyclopedic references grew shorter and then stopped. Within a generation or two, the word Tartary carried no geographic or political meaning for most people. It became a historical footnote, referenced occasionally in academic texts but stripped of any implication that it represented a unified or significant civilization. The standard historical explanation is straightforward. Tartaria was never a single unified state. It was a loose term used by European cartographers to describe the lands inhabited by Turkic and Mongol peoples east of Europe. As the Russian and Chinese empires expanded and mapped these territories in detail, the vague collective term was replaced by more accurate and specific geographic designations. The name faded because it was imprecise, not because anything was deliberately hidden. That explanation is reasonable. But it leaves a few things unaddressed. First, the consistency. If Tartaria was just a vague catch-all term, why did so many cartographers across different countries and centuries agree on its general boundaries, its internal divisions, and its major cities? Vague terms tend to shift dramatically from one mapmaker to another. Tartaria didn't. Its borders varied, as all pre-modern borders did, but its core territory and structural identity remained remarkably stable across 200 years of cartography. Second, the references outside of maps. Diplomatic correspondence from multiple European courts references Tartarian rulers, Tartarian ambassadors, and Tartarian trade goods. Travel accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe Tartarian cities with infrastructure, governance, and commerce. These aren't mythological accounts. They read like practical descriptions of a functioning society. Third, the speed of the disappearance. Political entities get absorbed by empires all the time throughout history. But they usually leave a clearer residue. Cultural memory, linguistic traces, architectural remnants, local traditions that reference the older identity. With Tartaria, the erasure was remarkably clean. Within the span of roughly 50 to 70 years, a name that had defined the largest territory on European maps for centuries became essentially meaningless. None of this proves that Tartaria was a single advanced civilization. But it does establish that the region was documented far more consistently and specifically than the current historical treatment suggests. And it does raise the question of why the transition from a recognized geopolitical entity to a forgotten term happened so quickly and so thoroughly. The maps tell us that something was there. The buildings, if they are connected, might tell us what it looked like. But there's a third layer to this, and it has to do with timing. If you were to plot every major city fire, every catastrophic flood, every unexplained urban reset that occurred during the 19th century, you'd end up with a map that looks less like a series of random disasters and more like a pattern. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. San Francisco, multiple times before the famous 1906 earthquake. Large portions of London, Moscow, Istanbul, and dozens of other cities experienced devastating fires during this same general period. Many of these fires were attributed to common causes: dry conditions, wooden construction, industrial accidents. And in many cases, those explanations are perfectly adequate. But in some cases, the official accounts leave room for questions. The Great Chicago Fire is one of the most studied urban disasters in American history, and yet fundamental aspects of it remain debated. The fire destroyed over 17,000 structures across more than 2,000 acres. The rebuilding happened with remarkable speed, and the city that emerged looked substantially different from what had existed before. Older photographs show a pre-fire Chicago with large stone and brick buildings, ornate facades, and infrastructure that seems inconsistent with a city that was only a few decades old at the time. This same pattern appears in other cities. San Francisco before the 1906 earthquake shows a dense urban core with massive buildings, elaborate civic architecture, and infrastructure that, again, seems beyond what the city's short official history would suggest. The earthquake and subsequent fires destroyed much of this, and what was rebuilt followed different architectural conventions. Then there are the World's Fairs. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago is perhaps the most frequently cited example. According to the official record, the fairgrounds, which included enormous neoclassical buildings with columns, domes, statues, canals, and electrical lighting, were constructed as temporary structures in approximately 2 years using a combination of plaster, jute, and steel frames over wooden structures. A material called staff, essentially plaster reinforced with fiber, was used for the facades. The photographs of these buildings are extraordinary. They depict structures of immense scale and detail. Grand colonnaded halls, domed pavilions, elaborate sculptural programs integrated into the architecture. All of it, according to the record, built to be temporary and demolished shortly after the fair ended. Similar fairs took place in cities around the world during this period. Paris, St. Louis, Buffalo, Melbourne, Brussels. Each one featured enormous architectural complexes that were built quickly, displayed briefly, and then largely destroyed. The question people raise is whether all of these structures were genuinely built from scratch in the timelines documented, or whether some of them were pre-existing buildings that were repurposed for the fairs and then demolished afterward to make way for new development. This is where the mud flood observations enter the conversation. Across dozens of cities in North America, Europe, and Russia, there are buildings whose ground floors appear to have been buried. Windows that now sit at sidewalk level or below grade. Doors that open into walls of earth. Basement levels with architectural detailing, full-sized windows, and ceiling heights that suggest they were originally above-ground stories. In some cities, this has been openly documented. Seattle's underground tour, for example, takes visitors through the original street level of the city, which was buried under fill after a fire in 1889 and a decision to raise the street grade. Portland, Oregon has similar underground sections. In cities across the American Midwest and parts of Europe, buildings that were clearly designed with ground floor entrances now have those entrances several feet below the current street level. The conventional explanation varies by location. Street grading projects, flood management, urban development that raised road levels over time. These explanations are well documented in many cases. But in other cases, the burial of the lower floors doesn't align with any documented grading project. Buildings in cities without significant flood histories show the same buried first stories. And the consistency of the phenomenon across such a wide geographic range is notable. When you combine the buried architecture with the major urban fires, the World's Fair demolitions, and the speed with which cities were supposedly built from nothing into metropolises, a timeline question emerges. Were all of these cities built in the time frames we've been told? Or is it possible that some of this infrastructure predates the official founding narratives and was inherited, modified, damaged, buried, and in some cases, destroyed during the 19th century? This is not a conclusion. It's a question that the physical evidence makes reasonable to ask. And if you're going to ask it, the next thing to look at is the buildings themselves, specifically, the features that don't seem to serve any obvious structural or decorative purpose. Among all the questions surrounding 19th century architecture, this one is probably the most speculative, and for that reason, it needs to be handled with the most care. But it also can't be ignored because the physical features are real, they're measurable, and they exist in large numbers across many countries. On top of many old civic buildings, cathedrals, and government structures from the 18th and 19th centuries, you'll find metallic elements that don't have a clear structural or decorative function. Spires topped with metal finials, copper-clad domes, iron rods extending from rooftops, ornate metalwork crowning towers that, from an engineering perspective, serve no load-bearing or weather protection purpose. Some of these features have been explained as lightning rods, and in many cases, that explanation is probably correct. Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity in the mid-1700s led to the widespread adoption of lightning rods on tall buildings. That's well documented. But not all of these metallic rooftop features match the profile of a lightning rod. Some are far more elaborate than anything needed for simple electrical grounding. Some include mercury-filled rotating elements, such as the devices historically found atop certain mosque minarets and cathedral spires. Others incorporate arrays of metallic spikes, copper mesh, or complex antenna-like configurations that go well beyond what lightning protection requires. Then there are the buildings themselves. Many old-world structures were built with materials that have specific electromagnetic properties. Granite, which contains high concentrations of quartz. Iron frameworks embedded in masonry walls. Copper roofing and flashing. These materials, in the configurations found in these buildings, are consistent with structures that could interact with atmospheric electrical fields. This is where historical context becomes important. Before Thomas Edison and the commercialization of electrical power in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a substantial body of scientific work on atmospheric electricity. Researchers like Nikola Tesla, Nathan Stubblefield, and others explored the possibility of harvesting electrical energy directly from the atmosphere and the ground. Tesla's experiments at Colorado Springs and his plans for the Wardenclyffe Tower were explicitly designed around the principle that the Earth and its atmosphere constitute a natural electrical system that could be tapped for usable power. Tesla's work is well documented. So is the fact that his funding was cut, his tower was demolished, and his vision of free atmospheric energy was never commercialized. The reasons given are financial and practical, and those reasons may be entirely sufficient. But here's what's worth observing. Many of the architectural features found on pre-Edison buildings are physically consistent with the principles Tesla was working with. Tall structures with metallic tops. Buildings constructed with piezoelectric materials like quartz-bearing granite. Interior spaces with specific geometric proportions that correspond to known acoustic and electromagnetic resonance patterns. ventilation and channel systems built into walls that could, in principle, function as waveguides. This doesn't mean these buildings were power stations. It doesn't mean anyone was harvesting free energy from the atmosphere in the 1700s. What it means is that the physical features of these buildings are compatible with electrical principles that were being actively explored during the same period, and that compatibility raises questions worth asking. There are also the old photographs of cities at night before widespread electrical infrastructure was installed. Some of these photographs show illuminated streets and buildings in cities that, according to the record, did not yet have electrical grids. Gas lighting accounts for some of this. But in certain images, the quality and distribution of the light doesn't match what gas lamps typically produce. Again, photographs can be misleading. Exposure times, processing techniques, and reproduction methods all affect how light appears in 19th century images. This is not strong evidence on its own. But it's another data point in a larger pattern of features that don't quite fit the standard timeline of technological development. The responsible approach here is to note the physical features, acknowledge the historical context, and recognize that the gap between what these buildings appear to be capable of and what the historical record says they were used for has not been fully addressed. With that said, the biggest question isn't about any single building or any single technology. It's about why so much of this material is so poorly integrated into mainstream historical understanding. History is not a fixed record. It never has been. Every generation inherits a version of the past that has been shaped by the priorities, limitations, and perspectives of the people who wrote it down. This isn't controversial. It's how historiography works. The question is always about degree: how much shaping has occurred, and how much of what was left out was lost by accident versus lost by design. The 19th century was a period of extraordinary consolidation. Empires expanded. National identities were formalized. Educational systems were standardized. And with that standardization came a particular version of history, one that emphasized the narratives most useful to the emerging nation-states and colonial powers that were writing the textbooks. This is documented. The way British imperial history was taught in the 19th and early 20th centuries is dramatically different from how the same events are understood today. The same is true for American history, Russian history, and the history of virtually every nation that went through a period of centralization during this era. When institutions consolidate power, they also consolidate narrative. That's not a hidden truth. It's a well-studied phenomenon in academic historiography. So when we look at the questions raised in this video, the architectural consistencies, the cartographic record of Tartaria, the timeline problems, the energy-related building features, the question of erasure isn't whether it's possible. It's whether it applies here, and if so, to what extent. What we can observe is this: a significant number of buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries have been demolished, repurposed, or substantially altered over the past 150 years. In many cases, the demolitions were justified by urban development, safety concerns, or modernization. In some cases, the buildings that were torn down were among the most impressive and well-constructed structures in their respective cities. The old Penn Station in New York, demolished in 1963, is a famous example. A massive, ornate structure with vaulted glass ceilings and granite columns, replaced by a low-ceilinged underground station that is widely regarded as one of the worst architectural decisions in American history. But Penn Station is just one of hundreds. Across the United States, Europe, and Russia, grand civic buildings have been demolished throughout the 20th century at a rate that, when you step back and look at it, seems disproportionate to practical necessity. In many cases, what replaced these buildings was cheaper, simpler, and less durable. The justification was always practical. Maintenance costs. Structural concerns. The need for modern utilities. And in many cases, those justifications were genuine. Old buildings are expensive to maintain. They don't always meet modern safety codes. Cities change, and their buildings change with them. But there's a pattern worth noticing. The buildings most likely to be demolished were often the ones that were hardest to explain within the conventional historical framework. The ones that seemed too large, too sophisticated, or too old for their supposed origins. The ones that didn't quite fit. What remains is still substantial. Walk through the older districts of any major city, and you'll find buildings that carry the hallmarks discussed in this video. The arched windows. The column proportions. The buried lower floors. The metallic rooftop elements. They're still there, often hiding in plain sight, relabeled as Victorian, Beaux-Arts, or Neoclassical, categories that describe their style but don't fully explain their origins. There are also the oral traditions and cultural memories of peoples across Central Asia, Siberia, and other regions that were once labeled as Tartaria on European maps. These traditions speak of connected civilizations, shared knowledge systems, and a world that was more unified before the modern period than mainstream history typically acknowledges. Oral traditions are not the same as documented evidence, and they need to be handled with appropriate care. But they represent another thread in a larger fabric of information that hasn't been fully examined. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us with a set of observations that don't have complete explanations. Buildings that share too many features across too many locations. Maps that document a territory that has been largely forgotten. A timeline that contains gaps and inconsistencies. Architectural features that suggest capabilities beyond what the standard narrative accounts for. And a pattern of demolition and replacement that has reduced the available physical evidence over the past century. None of this constitutes proof of a single unified Tartarian civilization that spanned the globe. That's a claim that goes well beyond what the available evidence can support. What the evidence does support is a simpler but still significant conclusion, that the history of the 18th and 19th centuries contains more unresolved questions than most people realize, and that the built environment of that period deserves closer attention than it typically receives. The purpose of this video has not been to tell you what to believe. It has been to show you what's there, to organize the observations in a way that makes them easier to evaluate, and to encourage you to look at the buildings, the maps, the timelines, and the records for yourself. History belongs to everyone. And the best way to honor it is not to accept any single version uncritically, but to keep looking, keep questioning, and keep paying attention to the details that don't quite fit. Because those details, whatever they ultimately mean, are worth your time.